war that lasted 781 years. A struggle of blood, faith, and land that spanned generations. On the Iberian Peninsula, a great civilization once rose, Al-Andalus, a center of knowledge, art, and coexistence. And slowly, a door began to close. The Reconquista was not just a war. It was the fall of cities, the exile of peoples, and the quiet rewriting of history. In this video, we tell the story of the longest war in human history, from its beginning to its final breath, the forgotten, the unspoken, and the silent. The longest war in history. 7/11, when the gate opened. History is not always changed by a single sword strike, but sometimes by gates that open slowly. And one of those gates opened in the year 711 at the Strait of Gibraltar. That day, no one knew they were witnessing the first breath of a war that would last 781 years. Not the soldiers stepping off the ships, not the kings waiting on the opposite shore, not the ordinary people living on the Iberian Peninsula, but history knew. The Iberian Peninsula, silence before the storm. Before 711, the Iberian Peninsula, the lands of today's Spain and Portugal, was divided. There were kingdoms, but no unity, power, but no balance, thrones, but no legitimacy. The Visigothic kingdom was rotting from within. Kings distrusted their own people. Nobles waited in the shadows to overthrow them. Christianity existed, but not as a single belief. The church had grown powerful, while the people were crushed under heavy taxes. And at this fragile moment, another world arrived from the sea. Tariq ibn Ziyad and the burning ships. In North Africa, in the lands of modern-day Morocco, stood the armies of the Umayyad Caliphate. At their head was Tariq ibn Ziyad. In the spring of 711, with around 7,000 soldiers, he crossed the strait. The place still bears his name today, Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar. According to legend, as soon as Tariq stepped on land, he turned to his soldiers and said, "Behind you is the sea. Ahead of you is the enemy. There is no escape." And he ordered the ships burned. Whether legend or truth, the story captured the spirit of that moment, because there was no turning back. A conquest or a collapse? The Visigothic king Roderick did not take the threat seriously. His army was large, but its loyalty was weak. In 711, the Battle of Guadalete erupted, and in that battle, the Visigothic kingdom collapsed. King Roderick was killed, the throne fell, resistance shattered. But this was not a conquest decided by a single battle. It was the beginning of centuries of coexistence and conflict. Al-Andalus, the birth of a civilization. The Muslims remained on the Iberian Peninsula, and they called it Al-Andalus. But Al-Andalus was not merely military rule. On these lands, mosques rose, libraries were built, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy flourished. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in the same cities. While Europe entered its so-called Dark Ages, Al-Andalus became an island of knowledge. Cordoba had street lighting, Paris had mud. Libraries held hundreds of thousands of books. In Europe, books were chained. But this brilliance also created fear. The smoldering fury of the Christian kingdoms. In the north, beyond the mountains, small Christian kingdoms survived. Asturias, León, Navarre, Castile, and Aragon. At first they were weak, but they had one powerful thing: memory. They never forgot the lands they had lost, An idea was born. This peninsula was ours, and it must be taken back. That idea slowly became a movement. It had no name yet, but history would come to know it as the Reconquista. Reconquista, not a war, but an obsession. The Reconquista was not a single war. It was a war of generations, a hatred passed from father to son. Every reclaimed castle, every fallen city became a story, a vow, a debt of blood. Sometimes the war paused, sometimes it reignited, sometimes it looked like peace, but it never truly ended. The first step of a 781-year-long shadow. In 711, no one knew that this war would last until 1492. Nearly 7 million people would die. Al-Andalus would vanish, and Europe's destiny would change forever. But the first stone had moved, and history had begun its countdown. The gate opened in 711 did not only let an army through, it let in a 781-year-long bloody story. In the next episode, we will see how this conflict turned into a holy war, how religion became a weapon, and how the true face of the Reconquista was revealed, because the real war had only just begun.
The birth of holy war. Time passed. Years, decades, centuries. The gate opened in 711, never closed. Instead, with every passing century, it opened wider. Because this was no longer just about land, it was about faith. When religion becomes a weapon. The Christian kingdoms were not strong on their own, but they shared one thing: loss. And the church turned that loss into a weapon. From the pulpits, priests declared, "These lands are sacred. God demands they be reclaimed. To fight is to cleanse one's sins." For the first time, an idea took root. War equals worship. And that idea set thousands in motion. The Reconquista is named. By the 9th century, the Christian kingdoms were no longer merely defending themselves. They were advancing. For every city retaken, bells rang. For every fortress captured, masses were held. This movement now had a name: the Reconquista, the reclaiming. But this reclaiming was not only about stone and soil, it was about identity. Al-Andalus begins to fracture. Meanwhile, Al-Andalus was still powerful, but it was no longer united. The Umayyad Caliphate had collapsed, replaced by the Taifa kingdoms. Small emirates, small ambitions, relentless rivalries. They fought each other. And worst of all, some Muslim rulers began seeking help from Christian kings in exchange for gold, for temporary peace, for short-lived security. But history shows no mercy to temporary alliances. The fall of Toledo, the balance shifts. The year was 885. Toledo fell. This was not just another city. It was a piece torn from the heart of Al-Andalus. For the Christian world, it was a sign: we can win. The church declared it a miracle. Kings saw it as destiny. And the war became unstoppable. The crusading spirit reaches Iberia. In 1095, when Pope Urban II called for the Crusades, the Iberian Peninsula was already burning. The Reconquista merged with the crusading movement. Knights began arriving from across Europe, from France, from Italy, from the German lands. Men who claimed to fight for God But what they often left behind was burned villages, slaughtered civilians, forced conversions. The collapse of coexistence. This was Al-Andalus's most fragile point. For centuries, Muslims, Christians, and Jews had lived side by side. But once holy war took hold, that balance shattered. Now everyone had to choose a side, and those who tried to remain neutral were the first to fall. A war passed down through generations. In this war, soldiers aged, but the war did not. Grandfathers fought, fathers fought, sons fought. A child was born with an enemy already waiting, and this reality did not change for 781 years. Al-Andalus calls for help, the last hopes. Under mounting pressure from the north, Al-Andalus turned to North Africa for help. First came the Almoravids, then the Almohads. For a brief time, the tide seemed to turn. Some battles were won, some cities reclaimed. But the truth was simple. It was already too late. The Reconquista was no longer just a war. It had become an obsession. Las Navas de Tolosa, the breaking point. The year was 1212, the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. A united Christian coalition inflicted a devastating defeat on the Muslim armies. For Al-Andalus, this was the turning point. After this battle, cities fell faster, resistance weakened, and hope faded. And only one stronghold remained. The Reconquista could no longer be stopped. What began as a struggle for land had become a battle for souls. In the next episode, we will witness the final act, the fall of Granada in 1492, the end of a 781-year war, and the dark legacy it left behind. Because when some wars end, peace does not follow.
(1492), the final breath. 781 years. Longer than any human lifetime can comprehend. Yet for history, only a moment. And that moment arrived in the year 1492. Granada, the last stronghold. All that remained of Al-Andalus was the Emirate of Granada. One city. But not an ordinary one. Granada was the last breath of Al-Andalus. The Alhambra still stood. Water flowed through its gardens. Arabic poetry still adorned its walls. But beyond those walls, the world had changed. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. Spain was now united. King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile. History would remember them as the Catholic monarchs. To them, the Reconquista was not just a mission. It was a sacred inheritance that had to be completed. And Granada was its final piece. The siege began. The siege began in 1482. This was not a sudden assault. It was a slow suffocation. Fields were burned. Trade routes were cut. Hunger spread. Granada's ruler, Emir Abu Abdallah Boabdil, tried to resist. But betrayal existed within, and hope was gone beyond the walls. January 2nd, 1492. On that day, Granada fell. The keys were surrendered, the banners were lowered, the crosses were raised, and the 781-year war officially came to an end. But the story did not. Promises were broken. When Granada surrendered, agreements were made. It was said that Muslims would practice their faith freely. Mosques would be protected. No one would be forced. History would soon forget those promises. The Inquisition, a silent slaughter. The Catholic monarchs unleashed the Spanish Inquisition. The enemy was no longer the soldier, it was the neighbor. Forced baptisms began. Suspicion itself became a crime. Those who prayed in secret, those who spoke Arabic, those who held on to old traditions, they were exiled or burned. The Jews were not spared. 1492 marked another ending for the Jewish population of Spain. Tens of thousands were expelled. Some found refuge in the Ottoman Empire. Others died along the roads. The Reconquista did not only destroy Muslims, it destroyed the idea of coexistence itself. 7 million lives. In 781 years, in battles, in sieges, in massacres, in exile, nearly 7 million people lost their lives. Yet history books often record this only as a victory. Europe changed. The world changed. 1492 carried another meaning. In that same year, Christopher Columbus set sail. Knowledge expelled from Al-Andalus crossed into other continents, and Europe entered an entirely new era. The silent legacy of Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus is gone, but its legacy lives on in mathematics, in medicine, in architecture, in philosophy. Quietly. This 781-year war teaches us one thing. Some wars have no true winners, and some victories are simply humanity's defeat. This was the story of the longest war in history, but it was also the story of a silenced civilization, millions erased, and a dream of coexistence lost. History speaks, but sometimes the greatest stories are the ones told in silence.